Now, to the extent that banks may be reluctant to lend in certain situations, what are the real economic underpinnings of that reluctance?
Well, first of all, I think you have to remember that banks are in business to lend. I mean, the fundamental function of the commercial banking industry is the intermediary function. We are the intermediaries between people that have money, our depositors, and people or businesses that need money, our borrowers. Now, reluctance to lend, what does that mean right now? Well, first of all, there isn't, in the kind of economy that we have right now, there isn't as much loan demand as there would have been 2 years ago. There's also, I think it's fair to say, to expect banks, there's been a lot of legitimate criticism that money was too easy, that we were making, we as an industry, not necessarily we, my individual bank, were making credit too easy. We were making loans to on houses, on residences, to anybody that could fog a mirror. We were very easy with credit to small businesses, and so much more so than historically has been the case. So to now be critical when we are moving back to more traditional lending standards, I don't think is a particularly fair criticism, because we've been criticized for being too easy, and now we're being criticized for tightening up those standards. So I think and remember, it's also pretty natural that a lender would do that in an economic downturn, because lending is always a decision based on what our expectations of the future abilities of someone's to be able to repay. And whenever we are in the middle of an economic downturn, and we are at some point in a historic economic downturn, the future is pretty cloudy. And so it's not unreasonable to expect that lending standards would be different than they were leading up to the current downturn.
Now, there's been some suggestion that the banking industry has a responsibility to perhaps sacrifice on some level to help the country get into a recovery. If that were to be undertaken the way that some are suggesting, what would be the results?
Well, that's not really an argument that I buy. This has been called, for some banks within the financial services industry, a bailout. But remember, when this all first started, 12 banks were called into the president's office with Secretary Paulson at that time,
and President Bush's office,
and Chairman Bernanke, and were forced to take $25 billion of TARP money on. That was the initial rollout. Not all of those banks needed that. And there's also a misconception that it was very cheap money. It was not cheap. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the Treasury announced within the last 2 weeks that the government is going to profit to the tune of $17 billion so far on the CPP program, which is the part of TARP that gave money to banks specifically. Not the part of TARP that went to auto companies and to AIG and some other companies that were not banks. That's a tidy profit. I mean, in my part of the world, $17 billion is serious money. And so I think that a lot of the criticism, I mean, there's plenty of room for legitimate critics, but it should be based on the facts. And the fact is that the government's made $17 billion in this program.
One last question just in terms of policy. Today, the Federal Reserve announced that they're going to keep interest rates very low, and that's going to extend at least for the next quarter, presumably to try to do something about unemployment and so forth. What is the effect that that's going to have on the lending environment and on the profitability of banks?
Well, you know, banks are, the way we're managing in general, and I can't speak for, on a question like that, I can't really speak for all banks because I don't know how everybody's managing, and not everybody's managing the same way. But we are in general preparing for higher interest rates at some time because they can't go any lower than they are, essentially. I mean, when the overnight rate is 0, it can't go any lower than that. So we're preparing at some point for rates to rise. So, you know, managing in potentially changing interest rate environments is nothing new for banks. And being able to lend throughout those changes is nothing new for banks. So I don't think that holding rates low has any sort of negative impact. And as a Michigan banker, frankly, you know, we've been losing jobs in Michigan for nearly 10 years now. We started in 2000 and have been losing jobs ever since. And part of that time, when we were losing jobs in Michigan, the Fed was raising interest rates to slow down economic growth. Well, clearly Michigan was not enjoying that economic growth at that period in the early part of this decade. So, frankly, I think keeping rates fairly stable at fairly low rates is probably a pretty good thing for Michigan.
Okay. Art Johnson, Chairman of the American Bankers Association, thanks very much for talking with me. I'm Dan Calabrese, editor of the North Star National. Thank you for watching.